The black Mercedes pulled through the imposing iron gates of the Blackwood estate, its engine purring softly against the morning silence. Alexander Blackwood sat in the back seat, his fingers drumming against the leather armrest as familiar sights rushed past the tinted windows. 5 years. 5 long years since he had last seen this place, since he had walked away from everything that once defined him. The circular driveway stretched before them, lined with perfectly manicured hedges and flowering bushes that Maria had always tended with such care. His chest tightened at the memory. Sweet, devoted Maria, who had watched over his children while he conquered boardrooms across 3 continents. She had been more than a housekeeper, more than a nanny. She had been the steady heartbeat of his home when his own had been too focused on building an empire. As the car came to a stop, Alexander straightened his Italian silk tie and adjusted his platinum cufflinks. The merger with Harrison Industries had finally closed after years of negotiations, making him one of the wealthiest men in the country. Yet as he stared up at the mansion where he had once lived, where his children had grown up without him, success felt hollow and cold. The front door opened before he could reach it, and Mrs. Henderson, his longtime housekeeper, appeared with a mixture of surprise and uncertainty on her weathered face. She had aged, he noticed immediately. Gray streaked through her once brown hair, and worry lines creased her forehead. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "We weren't expecting you." "I wanted to surprise the children," Alexander replied, stepping into the marble foyer. The house felt different somehow, though nothing seemed to have changed. The same crystal chandelier hung overhead, the same oil paintings lined the walls, yet something was missing. "Where are Emma and James?" Mrs. Henderson's hands fidgeted with her apron. "They're at school, sir." "But, Mr. Blackwood, there's something you should know before later," he interrupted, already moving toward the grand staircase. "I want to freshen up first. Is my study still as I left it?" "Yes, sir," but he was already climbing the stairs, his leather shoes echoing against the marble steps. His study door stood slightly ajar, and, as he pushed it open, the familiar scent of leather books and his favorite cologne still lingered in the air. Everything was exactly as he had left it, from the crystal decanter on his desk to the family photo that faced his chair. Alexander picked up the silver-framed photograph, his thumb tracing over the glass. Emma had been 8 then, gap-toothed and grinning, while 10-year-old James had tried to look serious but couldn't quite hide his smile. And there, standing behind them with her hands gently placed on their shoulders, was Maria. Her dark hair had been pulled back in a simple bun, her uniform crisp and neat, but it was her eyes that had always captivated him. Even in this old photograph, they sparkled with warmth and intelligence. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, setting the photo back in its place. Mrs. Henderson entered, carrying a silver tray with coffee and his favorite biscuits. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as if she were walking on thin ice. "Sir, I really must tell you about how are the children, Mrs. Henderson?" Alexander asked, settling into his leather chair. "Has Emma gotten over her fear of thunderstorms? Is James still obsessed with those astronomy books?" The older woman set the tray down with trembling hands. "They've grown so much, Mr. Blackwood. Emma is 13 now, and she's become quite the artist. James is 15 and captain of his debate team." She paused, wringing her hands. "But, sir, about Maria." Something in her tone made Alexander look up sharply. A chill ran down his spine as he noticed the tears gathering in Mrs. Henderson's eyes. "What about Maria?" he asked slowly. Mrs. Henderson took a shaky breath. "Sir, she's not here anymore." "Not as your employee, anyway." The words came out in a rush, as if she needed to get them out before losing her nerve. "Mr. Blackwood, Maria is upstairs. In the servant quarters. But she's been there as a prisoner for over a year now." The coffee cup slipped from Alexander's fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. "What did you say?" "Your cousin, Mr. Richard Blackwood," Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "When you left for Europe, you put him in charge of the estate and the children. At first, everything was normal. Maria continued caring for Emma and James, just as she always had. But then, She trailed off, unable to meet his eyes. Alexander stood slowly, his legs feeling like lead. Then, what, Mrs. Henderson? Mr. Richard, he developed feelings for Maria. Inappropriate feelings. When she rejected his advances, when she threatened to tell you what he was doing, She was crying now, tears streaming down her cheeks. He had her locked up. He told everyone she had quit and left town. He hired new staff, people loyal to him. The children think Maria abandoned them. The room spun around Alexander as the words sank in. His hands gripped the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. Are you telling me that Maria has been imprisoned in my own house for over a year? Mrs. Henderson nodded miserably. I wanted to help her, Mr. Blackwood. I tried to get word to you, but your cousin intercepted all communications. He said if I interfered, he would have me arrested for theft. He planted evidence in my quarters, showed me what he would do if I spoke up. She sobbed openly now. I'm so sorry, sir. I failed her. I failed you. Alexander's mind reeled as fragments of memory crashed together. Richard's eagerness to manage the estate. The spotty communication during his time abroad. The strange, brief phone calls with the children where they seemed distant and subdued. How could he have been so blind? Where is she now? He demanded, his voice deadly quiet. Third floor, sir. The small room at the end of the hall. Mr. Richard had bars installed on the windows and a lock on the outside of the door. He brings her meals twice a day and... Mrs. Henderson couldn't finish the sentence. Alexander was already moving, taking the stairs 3 at a time. His heart pounded as he reached the 3rd floor, a part of the house that had always been reserved for additional staff quarters. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before him, each step echoing like thunder in the silence. At the end of the hall, he found it. A heavy wooden door with a new deadbolt lock installed on the outside. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys Mrs. Henderson had pressed into his palm. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to reverberate through his soul. Slowly, carefully, he pushed the door open. The room was small and spartanly furnished, with just a single bed, a small table, and one chair. Sunlight filtered through barred windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. And there, sitting by the window with her back to him, was Maria. She had grown thinner, her once glossy dark hair now dull and unkempt. She wore a simple gray dress that hung loosely on her frame. When she heard the door open, she turned slowly, and Alexander's heart shattered at what he saw. Her beautiful dark eyes, once so full of life and laughter, now held a wariness that spoke of months of fear and despair. There were faint bruises on her arms, and her cheeks were hollow with malnutrition. But it was the look of resigned hopelessness on her face that cut him deepest. Maria, he whispered, her name barely audible. For a moment, she simply stared at him as if he were a mirage. Then, her eyes widened with recognition and disbelief. Alexander? Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. You're really here? He crossed the room in 2 strides, dropping to his knees beside her chair. Oh God, Maria! What has he done to you? She recoiled slightly at his sudden movement, an instinctive response that made his blood boil with rage. How badly had Richard hurt her that she would flinch from a gentle touch? I'm sorry, he said softly, keeping his hands visible and his movements slow. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. If I had known. Maria's composure finally cracked, and tears began streaming down her pale cheeks. I thought you knew. I thought you had given permission for Richard to. She couldn't finish the sentence, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to hold the broken pieces together. Never, Alexander said fiercely. Never, Maria. I would never have allowed this. Richard acted without my knowledge, without my consent. What he's done. He ran his hands through his hair, struggling to find words adequate for his fury. What he's done is unforgivable. The children, Maria said suddenly, gripping his sleeve with surprising strength. Emma and James. Are they safe? Richard told me that if I caused any trouble, if I tried to escape, he would hurt them. I couldn't risk it. I couldn't let anything happen to them. Alexander's heart broke anew at the realization that even in her own suffering, Maria's first concern was for his children. She had endured imprisonment and abuse to protect Emma, and James had sacrificed her own freedom for their safety. They're safe, he assured her, covering her hand with his own. They're at school. They don't know what's happened. Richard told them you had quit and left. Fresh tears flowed down Maria's cheeks. They must hate me. They must think I abandoned them without saying goodbye. We'll make this right, Alexander promised, his voice thick with emotion. We'll tell them the truth. We'll make sure they know that you never would have left them willingly. That you were protecting them. Maria nodded, but he could see the doubt in her eyes, the fear that too much damage had been done to ever repair the bonds that had once been so strong. Alexander helped her to her feet, noticing how she swayed slightly with weakness. When did you last eat? He asked. This morning, she replied. Richard brings me bread and soup twice a day. Sometimes fruit, if he's in a good mood. The casual way she spoke about her meager rations made Alexander's jaw clench. He would make Richard pay for every moment of suffering he had caused, for every meal denied, for every tear shed in this godforsaken room. Come, he said gently, offering his arm for support. Let's get you out of here. You'll never have to see this room again. As they walked slowly down the hallway, Maria suddenly stopped. Alexander, she said, her voice trembling. There's something else. Something you need to know about your children. His blood ran cold. What about them? Richard, he's been using them. Manipulating them. He's told them stories about you, convinced them that you don't care about them anymore. He's been positioning himself as their protector, their real father figure. She looked up at him with anguish in her eyes. I think he's planning something. Something to make sure you never get them back. The full scope of Richard's betrayal hit Alexander like a physical blow. Not only had he imprisoned and abused Maria, but he had been systematically poisoning Alexander's own children against him. The merger that had taken so long to complete, the communications that had been mysteriously difficult, the strange behavior from Emma and James during their brief phone calls, it all made horrible sense now. How long? He asked through gritted teeth. It started slowly, about 6 months after you left. Little comments about how busy you were, how you had more important things to worry about than them. Then, it escalated. He would show them fake emails supposedly from you, canceling visits or cutting conversations short. He even hired actors to play your voice on phone calls sometimes, making you sound cold and dismissive. Alexander felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed to provide for his family, had been twisted into a weapon against him. His own cousin had systematically destroyed his relationship with his children while committing unspeakable crimes against the woman who had cared for them all. We have to be careful, Maria continued as they descended the main staircase. Richard still has allies here. Staff members who believe his version of events. And the children. She paused, pain evident in her voice. They may not believe you at first. He's been very thorough in his manipulation. As they reached the main floor, Alexander heard the sound of car doors slamming outside. Through the tall windows, he could see a black sedan pulling into the circular drive. His heart rate accelerated as he recognized the license plate. It was Richard's car. He's back, Maria breathed, instinctively moving closer to Alexander. Alexander's hands clenched into fists as he watched his cousin step out of the car, straightening his expensive suit jacket and checking his watch with the casual arrogance that had always grated on Alexander's nerves. Behind Richard, 2 large men in dark suits emerged from the car, men Alexander didn't recognize but whose purpose was clearly intimidation. Stay behind me, Alexander told Maria, positioning himself between her and the front door. The sound of footsteps on the marble floor announced Richard's entry before he appeared in the doorway of the main hall. When he saw Alexander standing there with Maria, his face went through a series of rapid changes: surprise, confusion, and, finally, cold calculation. Well, Richard said, his voice smooth as silk despite the tension crackling through the air. "My dear cousin returns. And, I see you found our houseguest." "Houseguest?" Alexander's voice was deadly quiet. "Is that what you call imprisonment and abuse?" Richard's laugh was cold and humorless. "Imprisonment? Alexander, you've been away too long. You don't understand the situation here. Maria came to me with some very serious accusations about her behavior with the children. Inappropriate behavior. I had no choice but to restrict her movements until we could sort things out properly." "You're lying," Maria said, her voice stronger than it had been upstairs. "You know that's not what happened." "The word of a servant against a Blackwood?" Richard shook his head sadly. "Who do you think people will believe, my dear?" Alexander stepped forward, his body coiled with barely restrained violence. "Get out of my house, Richard. Now." "Your house?" Richard's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Oh, Alexander, I'm afraid you're quite mistaken. This house, this estate, all of it belongs to me now. Legal guardianship of the children, power of attorney over the estate, all perfectly legitimate, all signed by you before you left for Europe." The words hit Alexander like ice water. In his rush to finalize the merger deal, he had indeed signed papers giving Richard temporary authority. But temporary was supposed to mean months, not years. And it certainly didn't include the right to imprison innocent people. "Those documents were temporary," Alexander said, but, even as he spoke, he could see the triumphant gleam in Richard's eyes. "Ah, but, when the guardian fails to maintain contact with his wards, when he abandons his responsibilities for years at a time, the temporary can become permanent. I have court documents, Alexander. Legal precedent. The children have been under my care and protection for 5 years. They call me father now." As if summoned by his words, the sound of young voices echoed from the front hall. Alexander's heart clenched as he recognized the laughter of his children returning from school. In moments, they would walk into this nightmare scenario, unprepared and unprotected. "Emma! James!" Richard called out cheerfully. "Come say hello to your father. He's decided to pay us a visit." Alexander watched in horror as his children entered the room. Emma, now 13, had inherited her mother's delicate features but carried herself with a wariness that hadn't been there before. James, 15 and tall for his age, wore an expression of polite confusion rather than the joy Alexander had hoped to see. "Father?" Emma said, the word awkward on her tongue. "We thought you were still in Singapore." "Switzerland," James corrected quietly. "Uncle Richard said you were too busy with your new business to come home for Christmas again." The casual way they spoke of his absence, the lack of excitement in their voices, cut deeper than any physical blow could have. These were his children, his babies, and they looked at him like a distant relative they barely remembered. And then, Emma's eyes fell on Maria, standing behind Alexander, and her young face transformed with a mixture of shock, betrayal, and something that looked almost like fear. "Maria," she whispered. "But, Uncle Richard said you left. He said you quit because you didn't want to take care of us anymore." Alexander watched Maria's face crumple as she saw the pain in Emma's eyes, the confusion in James's posture. 5 years of love and devotion had been erased by months of lies and manipulation. "I never wanted to leave you," Maria said, her voice breaking. "I never would have left you willingly." "Then, where have you been?" James demanded, his voice cracking with emotion. "We waited for you. We kept asking Uncle Richard when you were coming back, and he said you had made it clear you never wanted to see us again." The room fell silent except for the sound of Maria's quiet sobbing. Alexander felt the weight of his failures pressing down on him like a physical force. He had lost 5 years with his children, and, in that time, the people he loved most had been systematically hurt and manipulated by someone he had trusted. Richard smiled, clearly pleased with how the reunion was unfolding. "As you can see, Alexander, your sudden return has upset the children. They've moved on. We all have. Perhaps it would be best if you continued your travels. The merger is complete, after all." surely there are other business opportunities to pursue. Alexander looked at his children's faces, saw the confusion and pain there, and made a decision that would change everything. He had built an empire by being ruthless when necessary, by fighting for what mattered most. His children and Maria mattered more than any business deal ever could. "No," he said simply. "I'm not leaving. This is my home, these are my children, and Maria is under my protection. You have exactly 1 hour to pack your belongings and get off my property, Richard. After that, I'm calling the police." Richard's mask of civility finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, cousin. You see, I've spent 5 years building a case against you. Abandonment, neglect, financial impropriety. By the time my lawyers are finished, you'll be lucky to have visiting rights, much less custody." The two large men who had arrived with Richard stepped forward slightly, making their presence known. The threat was clear, this wasn't just a legal battle anymore. Alexander looked at his children, at Maria, at the home he had worked so hard to build and provide for. Everything hung in the balance, and he realized that the real fight for his family was just beginning. The tension in the grand hall stretched like a wire ready to snap. Alexander could feel his children's eyes on him, watching this confrontation unfold between the man they barely remembered as their father and the uncle who had filled that role for years. The weight of their confusion was almost unbearable. "Emma, James," Alexander said softly, his voice careful and controlled despite the rage burning in his chest. "I need to speak with your uncle privately. Mrs. Henderson, would you please take them to the kitchen for some milk and cookies?" "We're not children anymore," James said, his voice carrying the defiant edge that comes with being 15. "We can hear whatever you need to say." Emma, however, was staring at Maria with a mixture of longing and anger that tore at Alexander's heart. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Did you really never leave?" Before Maria could answer, Richard smoothly interjected. "Now, Emma, sweetie, you know how confused Maria can get. She's been having some mental health issues lately. That's why we've been taking such good care of her." The lie was delivered so smoothly, with such practiced concern, that Alexander could see his daughter wavering. 5 years of trust in her uncle warred against the evidence of her own eyes. "That's not true," Maria said firmly, stepping forward despite her obvious fear. "Emma, do you remember the story I used to tell you about the brave princess who saved her kingdom? You always said you wanted to be like her when you grew up." Emma's eyes widened. It was clearly a story only the two of them had shared, a private moment that Richard couldn't have fabricated. "The princess who learned that sometimes the greatest courage is knowing when to ask for help," she whispered. "That's right," Maria smiled through her tears. "And sometimes grown-ups need help too, even when they're trying to protect the people they love." Alexander watched his daughter's face as understanding began to dawn. She was intelligent, had always been perceptive beyond her years, and he could see her starting to piece together the inconsistencies in Richard's story. James, however, remained skeptical. "If you never left," he said to Maria, his voice hard, "then where have you been? Why didn't you answer our letters? We wrote to you at the address Uncle Richard gave us." "What address?" Alexander asked sharply, turning to his son. "Uncle Richard said Maria had moved to Portland," James explained. "He helped us write letters asking her to come back, but they were always returned unopened. He said it proved she didn't want anything to do with us." The cruelty of it took Alexander's breath away. Richard had not only imprisoned Maria but had used her absence to further wound his children, making them complicit in what they believed was their caretaker's abandonment of them. "There were no letters," Maria said gently. "I'd been here, in this house, the whole time. I couldn't contact you because..." She glanced nervously at Richard, who was watching the exchange with growing displeasure. "Because she was being treated for her delusions," Richard finished smoothly. "Alexander, surely you can see that this conversation is upsetting the children. They've been through enough trauma with Maria's episodes." But Emma was no longer listening to her uncle. She was studying Maria's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "You're thinner," she observed.
And, your hands, they're different. Alexander looked and saw what his daughter had noticed.
Maria's hands, once soft and well cared for from her work in the house, now bore calluses and small scars. Her nails were bitten down to the quick, and there was a tremor in her fingers that spoke of prolonged stress.
Different how?
James asked, moving closer to examine Maria himself.
Like when Grandma was in the hospital, Emma said quietly. Remember?
Her hands got all thin and shaky because she wasn't eating enough.
The observation hung in the air like an accusation.
Alexander saw Richard's jaw tighten as he realized his carefully constructed narrative was beginning to crumble under the scrutiny of two intelligent teenagers.
That's enough, Richard said, his voice sharp for the first time. Children, go to your rooms. The adults need to discuss some complicated legal matters.
No, Alexander said firmly.
They stay. They're old enough to hear the truth, and they deserve to know what's been happening in their own home. Richard's mask slipped further. This isn't your decision to make anymore, Alexander.
As their legal guardian, you were granted temporary authority, Alexander interrupted.
Temporary.
And only because I trusted you to protect my family, not exploit them. He turned to his children, his heart breaking at the wariness in their eyes.
Emma, James, I know this is confusing. I know you have every right to be angry with me for being away so long. But I need you to understand something very important. Everything your uncle has told you about why I stayed away, about the letters and phone calls, it's not true.
Of course it's not true, Richard laughed, but there was a forced quality to it now.
Alexander, your guilt over abandoning your children is making you paranoid. You signed the papers giving me custody. You chose your business over your family. These fantasies about conspiracy and imprisonment are just your way of avoiding responsibility.
The words hit their mark, and Alexander saw doubt creep back into his children's eyes.
How could he explain 5 years of absence?
How could he make them understand that every day away from them had been agony, that every business deal had been motivated by his desire to provide for their future? He's lying, Maria said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been since Alexander found her.
James, Emma, do you remember the video calls we used to have when your father was traveling? Both children nodded.
You would help us talk to him every Sunday, Emma said.
That's right. And, do you remember what happened about 6 months after he left for Europe? James frowned, thinking. The calls got weird. Dad seemed different. Colder. And, shorter, Emma added.
He used to talk to us for an hour, but then it was only 10 or 15 minutes. And he stopped asking about my art classes.
Alexander's heart clenched.
He had never stopped caring about Emma's art, had never cut their calls short. But if Richard had been intercepting communications, manipulating video calls somehow. That's because those weren't really calls with your father, Maria said gently. Your uncle was using technology to make it seem like you were talking to him.
Deep fake technology.
I saw him practicing, learning to mimic your father's voice and expressions.
Richard's face had gone pale.
That's absurd.
The children are imagining things.
Maria, your mental state, I can prove it, Maria interrupted, looking directly at Alexander.
Check your phone records. Check your credit card statements from that time period.
I guarantee you'll find charges for software and equipment you never purchased, calls you never made. Alexander was already pulling out his phone, his fingers flying over the screen as he accessed his account information. Years of meticulous financial record-keeping served him well as he scrolled through months of transactions.
Here, he said, his voice tight with fury. September 15th, 3 years ago.
A charge for $2,400 to a company called Digital Persona Solutions.
I've never heard of them. He continued scrolling. October 3rd, $850 to Advanced Audio Systems. November 12th, $1,200 to Voice Synthesis Technologies.
His head snapped up to stare at Richard.
What are these companies?
Richard's composure was cracking visibly. The two men he had brought with him shifted uncomfortably, clearly not prepared for this kind of detailed financial evidence.
Those could be anything, Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. Business expenses that you've forgotten about.
No, Alexander said, his voice deadly calm.
I remember every business expense. Every legitimate business expense.
These companies appear to specialize in creating fake audio and video content.
The kind used to deceive children into thinking they're talking to their father when they're not.
Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth.
Uncle Richard? Is that true? Were we not really talking to Daddy?
The pain in her voice was like a knife through Alexander's heart. His 13-year-old daughter had spent years believing her father was growing cold and distant, not knowing that she was talking to a computer-generated imposter. James was staring at his uncle with a mixture of confusion and growing horror.
But why? Why would you do that?
Richard straightened his tie, his lawyer's training kicking in as he tried to regain control of the situation. Even if what you're suggesting were true, he said carefully, it was done to protect you children. Alexander was becoming unreliable, missing calls, breaking promises. I simply ensured that you had some contact with him, even when he was too busy to bother himself.
Liar, Alexander said flatly.
I never missed a scheduled call with my children.
Not once.
I built my entire schedule around those Sunday conversations.
He turned to Emma and James, his voice gentle but urgent. Do you remember when I supposedly told you I wouldn't be home for Emma's birthday 3 years ago? Emma nodded, tears starting to flow.
You said the merger was more important than some silly party.
Alexander felt like he was going to be sick. I never said that. I would never say that.
I tried for weeks to reach you to confirm the details for your party. When I couldn't get through, I sent gifts and a video message through the lawyer handling my European affairs.
Did you ever receive them?
Both children shook their heads, and Alexander saw understanding finally dawning in their eyes. The magnitude of Richard's deception was becoming clear, not just to him but to his children as well.
The party, Emma whispered. Uncle Richard said you had sent a message saying we should just cancel it because you weren't coming. So we didn't have one.
Alexander closed his eyes, remembering the frantic calls he had made that day, trying to reach his daughter on her birthday. He had assumed the time difference had caused confusion, that maybe they were busy with party preparations. He had never imagined that his own cousin was ensuring his messages never reached his children. I called 17 times that day, he said quietly. I left voicemails, sent emails, even had my assistant call the house.
Nothing got through.
Mrs. Henderson, who had been standing quietly in the corner, suddenly spoke up. Mr. Richard had the phone system changed, she said, her voice shaking. He installed new equipment that let him screen all incoming calls. He said it was for security, but
it was to isolate the children, Alexander finished.
To make sure I couldn't contact them directly. Richard was backing toward the door now, his two companions moving with him. The carefully constructed fantasy he had built was collapsing, and Alexander could see him calculating his next move. This is all very interesting speculation, Richard said, but the fact remains that I have legal custody of these children.
Whatever arrangements you think you made during your brief visit don't change that reality.
Actually, they do, a new voice said from the front hall.
Everyone turned to see a woman in a severe black suit walking into the room, followed by 2 uniformed police officers. She was carrying a briefcase and several official-looking documents.
I'm Detective Sarah Martinez, she announced, showing her badge.
Mr. Blackwood, we received some very interesting information about this household from your lawyer about an hour ago. Alexander's head spun. He hadn't contacted any lawyers since arriving. I don't understand.
Detective Martinez smiled grimly. Your corporate legal team has been investigating some irregularities in your accounts for months.
Apparently, someone has been using your financial information to make unauthorized purchases.
When they traced the spending patterns, they discovered evidence of identity theft, fraud, and... She looked directly at Richard, unlawful imprisonment. Richard's face went ashen. That's ridiculous.
I have power of attorney. Everything I've done has been legal.
power of attorney doesn't include the authority to imprison household staff, Detective Martinez replied coolly. Or to use advanced technology to impersonate your cousin in communications with his minor children. Or to forge legal documents extending your guardianship beyond the original terms. She gestured to one of the officers, who stepped forward with handcuffs. Richard Blackwood, you're under arrest for fraud, identity theft, unlawful imprisonment, and child endangerment. The room erupted into chaos. Richard's two companions tried to move toward the door, but the second police officer was ready for them. Emma burst into tears, overwhelmed by the revelations and the sudden appearance of law enforcement. James stood frozen, his world tilting as he tried to process everything that had happened. Through it all, Maria remained calm, though Alexander could see her hands shaking. She moved protectively toward the children, her maternal instincts overriding her own trauma. "It's all right," she told Emma, pulling the crying girl into her arms. "It's over now. Your father is here, and we're all going to be okay." As the officers led Richard away, he turned back one last time. "This isn't over, Alexander," he called out. "You think you can just waltz back in after 5 years and undo everything? The children don't know you anymore. They don't trust you. You're a stranger to them, and no amount of money or legal maneuvering will change that." The words were meant to wound, and they hit their target. Alexander looked at his children, Emma sobbing in Maria's arms, James standing rigid with confusion and anger, and realized that while he might have won this battle, the war for his family's trust was far from over. Detective Martinez approached him as the others were led away. "Mr. Blackwood, we'll need detailed statements from everyone in the household. This case is going to require extensive documentation." Alexander nodded, but his attention was on his family. Emma had pulled away from Maria and was staring at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Daddy," she said, and the word sounded strange in her mouth, as if she were trying out a foreign language. "Is it really you? Like, really you?" Alexander knelt down so he was at her eye level. "It's really me, sweetheart. I'm so sorry it took me so long to figure out what was happening. I'm so sorry you've been hurt." Emma studied his face carefully, as if memorizing his features. "You look older," she observed. "And sadder." "I feel older," Alexander admitted. "And I have been very sad, being away from you and James for so long." James hadn't moved from his position near the wall. His arms were crossed defensively, and his expression was guarded. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Do we just pretend the last 5 years never happened? Do we go back to being a happy family like in the movies?" The question hung in the air, heavy with pain and skepticism. Alexander realized that his son's caution was well-founded. Trust, once broken, couldn't be rebuilt with Explan.